Hi, my name is Hannah, and I'm going to be talking to you all today about Catherine McKittrick's article on plantations, prisons, and a Black sense of place. So the introduction of this article dives into a short summary of what to expect in the article, gives some pertinent background information to better understand the article, describes significance, influence, potential, and a quote that I think really resonated with me and kind of set the tone for the rest of the article is in the top left-hand corner. There is something organic to civil society that makes it essential to the destruction of the Black body. And I immediately thought back to the very first few weeks of the course when we were discussing how racism is literally embedded and built into the fabric of America, right? And I think this article does a great job of being the summation of all the course material that we've learned, even if it's focusing on Black geography and racial violence, it really pulls a lot of other concepts that we've learned. So what is racial violence? Racial violence is concrete and epistemic actions and structural patterns intended to harm, kill, or coerce a particular grouping of people. And I think the overlooming theme that's kind of introduced in the introduction and seen throughout the rest of the article can kind of be summed up in this mini thesis I put in the bottom. How does the history of slavery and racism demonstrate examples of racial violence? And how is this embedded in geography and place, right? So how is this history of racial violence and how is racial violence still being continued out in Black geographies and place? Jumping right into the meat and potatoes of the article, Black place and geography. The system cannot embrace Blackness and its history and has continued to have distinct racialized geographies that lead to difficulties and entanglements. We kind of have this avoidant nature when we are talking about racism in this country. I believe it was Ta-Nehisi Coles who said something at the beginning of the semester about how we'll talk about race, but we don't talk about racism. Like, we're not addressing the problem. And it is a systemic issue that requires more than just one chapter in a textbook to like educate and solve, right? So we don't embrace Blackness in its history. And this has led to this kind of tension between Black people and white people, Black place versus white place, and this distinction. So something to keep in mind. Black place is associated with changing geographies and historical contexts. Yet segregation, racial violence, and Black geographies do not solely define Blackness, they merely shape it. The colonial narrative is not absolute, and there is a Black narrative that needs to come to light. So when I think of this, I think of Black resiliency, and there's kind of like this pity associated that needs to be removed, right? It's nothing, it's this Black resiliency and this implementing critical race theory, or a better explanation and Black narrative into the education system to help balance out that colonial narrative and decolonize the system, right? So yeah, Black place is fundamentally built on this diasporic movement from slavery and coloniality, dehumanization, resistance. So there are all these moving parts. Plantations. Plantations are evidence of the colonial racial economy. This economy exploits Black bodies violently while constraining and sanctioning Black place and geographies. I really want to emphasize the constraining and sanctioning because I think that's a really important key to all this. It's not just, the racial violence, but how is this playing out through constraining and sanctioning? So like in terms of herbicide, we can think of like redlining, how there's distinct geographic boundaries for Black place versus white place, even though you're not physically getting constrained to walking across the other side of the road, right? So that's something to keep in mind versus like prison when you're physically getting constrained. You lose your sense of self, you lose all your possessions, right? It's just you and this place, right, in the prison. So that's something that's fascinating to me. Plantation economy, well, what is it? So the plantation economy is exploitation of Black slaves for economic and European gain and superiority. normalized Black dispossession, white supremacy, colonial narratives, racial geographies while naturalizing racism and land exploitation, right? So this is the power kind of component that also gets introduced to all of this, Black movement is not just Black people moving around the place. It's this relationship of how Black movement is associated with power. And so how did moving across America change this level of power? And Tuzla, at its height, Black people had more power in this physical geographical place versus LA during like the LA riots, so it has all these different things, or the Black Belt when there was tons of policing going on, right? So understanding how that power also plays a role, right? And that can be rooted into the plantation economy. And in the plantation economy, the power is coming from colonial white European narratives, right? So normalized Black dispossession, white supremacy, and colonial narratives, while naturalizing racism and land exploitation. So that's that key point of it's literally embedded in our system, right? So land exploitation, we'll get to that when we kind of talk about herbicide as well. So herbicide, this is the section that I thought was absolutely fascinating, right? Herbicide is the deliberate killing of a city. And it's not traditionally associated with America. It's a European thing with like military efforts normally kind of associated with it all. But however, there is an annihilation of Black geographies in terms of decay, incarceration, deportation, pollution, and gentrification. Blackness in America is deeply constrained by these environmental, social, and infrastructure decays, right? So when I'm talking about environmental decay, I'm going to be talking maybe about how Black communities don't have access to green spaces like white communities, and how does that affect their connection with nature, their health, right? So you can do that. Social decay, the closest thing that a Black community may have to social decay might be like a liquor store. They're in a concrete jungle and they live in a food desert where the closest store to their house is a liquor store, smoke shop, and not a Publix where they can get fresh produce, right? So that's like kind of social decay. Meanwhile, if you go in a white neighborhood, you can walk down the street and there'll be a farmer's market with fresh produce, right? So kind of understanding that. And then infrastructure decay is that communities and governments focus on economic boost of white communities who they think they'll be able to continue economic growth versus Black communities, or even infrastructure decay and the fact that there is no green space and they are living in this industrial community concrete jungle, right? So that's kind of what those mean, breaking that down. And to keep in mind when we're talking about these Black geographies and communities, they don't solely contain just Black bodies, but they're classified as these places of inclusion, normally minorities, low income, so low income people. So practices of resistance in these spaces are often swallowed up by herbicide. And that's where that kind of pity comes in from an outsider perspective, right? So redlining, I brought it up a second earlier on. So redlining in Jacksonville, I think it's a great example of Black geographies and how they've played out over time today. So redlining is the systemic denial of services to residents of specific racially associated neighborhoods. So if you look at this map, I hope you can see my little pointer. I'm looking at the peninsula here, which is about San Marco territory. The green areas are super, super ridiculously rich people. Red are not, poor, low income, generally minority communities. So if you look at this one little corner here, we have a green, super rich community. These are the $1 million houses on the river, right? Walk across the other side of the road, the other side of the railroad, and bam, here's a community that is a concrete jungle Black, historically Black community that is struggling, right? So this idea of redlining. And redlining in Jacksonville, actually, the city zoning, it goes back to Jim Crow time and when Jim Crow laws were around. So they actually haven't changed the city zoning or haven't really acknowledged redlining and have continued to support, even if it's unconscious, support this idea of segregation and Black geography and herbicide, right? So, and if you think about it, like how important is having a good place to live? Like, what are the opportunities that come for it? So maybe that's my question for you all. What can you think of like how living in a specific area can improve your opportunities in life? I know the one I immediately think of is education, school zoning, versus they're very finicky if you get into a good school versus not a good one. And I think health too. So if we're thinking about a Black community that doesn't have any green spaces, it's living in a concrete jungle, the heat index is going to be way up. That's going to affect health issues. They're working in industrial buildings, pollution, that's going to affect health issues. Water sanitation, all that good stuff, right? So health is another thing I can think of versus a white community or a rich white community. They're not going to have those issues, right? So that's just something that's interesting, how the history of racism has continued in Jacksonville, how that's seen through redlining. So I don't know if you have any other examples maybe in Jacksonville of how Black history has shaped Black geography in place. That'd be interesting to look into. So moving on, we're going to start talking about prisons, Plantations' future. This was fascinating to me. I had never really thought of it this way, so Ed Kitrick's perspective was really interesting in reading this. Okay, so the prison plantation connection thus provides with an almost perfect and thus discerning conceptual pathway. So this is this idea that the prison structure kind of mimics plantation economy. It's not twin, it's not exact. Obviously, there's some differences, but it's this idea of racial punishment, criminalization of Black bodies versus white ones, the demographic differences, where the extra policing is going on that is causing more Black bodies to be incarcerated, the amount of Black bodies in jail for severity of crime, like, understanding that, and even going into kind of how labor is done in the prison structure. Many prisons require prisoners to complete labor for under minimum wage. This is the idea of exploiting a body. And many of these prisons are filled with Black bodies, again, tying into that history of plantations. And then keeping in mind, I'm going to go back to this picture. Prisons have this dehumanizing, this picture is kind of cool when we're talking about this dehumanizing nature. You're not allowed to have any personal possessions in prison. You don't really have contact to the outside world. You literally cannot leave. You are constrained and sanctioned in a cell with nothing except your body and a few other bodies, right? And that is kind of ties into that plantation structure, which is you're not a human. You're just something for work. You're just something because you're not doing right. It's that dehumanization nature. So something, all these different correlations, right? So a question, how does the geographic and racial violence of history, history of slavery and effects of herbicides such as decay, pollution, gentrification play a role in the prison system in America? Think about specifics. So an example I think could be is over-policing Black communities and having them arrested over petty crimes. So this could be an example of how Black geography and herbicide play a role into the prison system. So there's more Black bodies in the prison system, right? So if you have any examples, to bring them up. So Black place here and now. This is interesting. I asked a few questions kind of throughout the presentation of how it is seen now. Where is Black place now? How is it rooted now? I talked about redlining in San Marco and Jacksonville. If you guys can think of any other places of how the history of plantations and where herbicide and the prison structure are playing a role in Black place and geography. There's a sign that was there that said, stop gentrification. Gentrification is a super interesting thing. And again, that can be tied to San Marco and how these rich white communities want more space to build these houses on waterfront property. So they're going to take over these Black communities and displace poor minority Black communities, and they're gonna have to move, and this increases the homeless population, right? So like, it's just interesting. So do you have any examples of Black geographies being rooted in racial violence, right? So Tuzla having white supremacy getting burned down to the ground, right? Over policing in the black belt. There's so many different examples, historical of it, examples. What is a modern one? So that's all I have. Thank you for listening to me talk.